Hi, my name's Terry Burt, and I'm an alcoholic. And I've been sober this time since July 23rd of 2009. My first sobriety date was in January of 2002. So, I didn't get it exactly the first time. I wanted to get it the first time, but that didn't happen. So let's go back to the beginning. I'm a Dallas native. Seems like one of the few, and I was born in 1950, so that makes me, haven't had a birthday yet this year, 71. So I love this part. I love to be able to tell young people, new people, I'm going like, back in my day. But this is a true statement, and believe it or not, this is a true statement. The day that I was born, there were no freeways in Dallas, Texas. The day that I was born. Now they might have been started, but they didn't finish those until the mid to late 50s. And I was born into a typical 50s family. We were very religious, one of the denominations that we've all heard about. And I quite literally went from the nursery at the hospital to the nursery at church, and went through all. I was a sunbeam for Jesus. Literally, the little guys. And I was born in 50, so I actually have three older brothers. My mom was married young, and her husband was tragically killed as a result of a fire. But they had one son. My oldest brother is now 85, and then there's a middle brother. My dad and mom married after World War II, and everybody was getting married, and the baby. I'm right at the peak of the baby boom, I think. And they had my older brother Jim, and so they had two boys, and they wanted to try for a girl. And they got two more boys. So my dad said, one time he goes, I was born at the old St. Paul, and my dad said he went out to the front steps and sat down and said, what are we going to do with two of them? But I will say this, I was a very precocious child. I was very much aware of my surroundings and the adults, and I was very much aware that I was in a dearly loving household. My parents loved us dearly. And so in those days, TV was brand new. Can you imagine that TV was ever new? We had this big box sitting in the living room, and we watched it. So the routine, and I'm very fond of this memory. This routine on Saturday nights before we would get up and go to church twice on Sunday was the common phrase for Jerry. My twin brother's name is Jerry. So we were referred to as the two little ones. We were premature, and back in those days, preemies didn't have a good chance. And they didn't have. We also didn't have the electronics that we do today. They didn't know I was even around. I was a total surprise. I mean, delivery room, you go, well, there's two of them, and but the routine on Saturday nights was for Jerry and I to get our bath, Saturday night bath, true story, and get into our jammies. And one would cuddle up with mom, and one would cuddle up with dad on the sofa and watch the Saturday night westerns, Gunsmoke, Paladin. But it had to start with Lawrence Welk. Whoa. We had to suffer through Lawrence. Two little boys had to suffer through Lawrence Welk. Oh my gosh! But I very clearly remember, and this is a very conscious memory of mine, that I'm sitting, snuggling up with mom or dad, and feeling very warm because in the wintertime or whatever, and safe and protected. I know that they got my back, and all is well. No problems, little kids. And so that's the way childhood was. Jerry and I were born in August, started school in September, so we were the youngest, and we were the smallest. So I started school with that idea that we're somewhat less than, we're the last, and like a lot of people that I've heard in our community, in sports, I indeed was the very last person to be picked for the team, and I was praying to be picked for right field in softball, because that's the least. You have the least percentage of getting that ball, because I knew that I was not going to catch that ball. and I didn't. And now there came a time in life when I really wanted to catch that ball, and I damn sure did, but not then. And but that was kind of the frame mindset that I grew up with. I just knew that we were going to be the smallest and the youngest and all that stuff. And all like I've heard so many times, on the outside looking in, feeling like we're kind of out there. But other than that, childhood was pretty normal until. And so, actually, let me back up a little bit. So with that religious upbringing, I'd been bombarded with all of the religious, spiritual message for 3 times a week, every on and on for 7 years. And so there was a Sunday night when I was about 6 or 7, and that message at the end of the sermon that we all know what that is about. That message, come down and walk the aisle and do this thing, and that had been on my mind, and they'd been tugging at me, and being the little bright kid that I was, I did that, and so the reason I even bring this up is that at that very, very young age, against all fear that I had, the terror of doing something like that, I stepped out in the aisle and put one foot in front of the other and walked through that fear to a point of courage. And that would come back in my life time after time after time. And but I learned that at a very early age. When I got, now fast forward several years, when I came to AA and started about this spiritual experience, I looked up on the internet a definition of spiritual experience, and I just want to read. At this point, I just want to read this, and it has to do with Bill Wilson too. But a spiritual experience is the adoption of new beliefs that differ from previous beliefs, a new identity, or a change from one identity to another. It's the internalization of that new belief system. A new reference point for one's identity, but may also present itself in other ways, such as adoption into a new identity group or spiritual lineage. That sounds like AA to me, And so, as time went on, then back to childhood, things were normal, and we just going to school, but that safe and protected ideal shattered about 3 years later. My mom started getting sick, and no one knew why. And so it took about 3 months for her to be correctly diagnosed, and then she lived about 6 weeks after she was diagnosed, but she had brain cancer. And so in the setting of having grown up in that religious environment where I was hammered with the idea, I'm not bashing religion, don't get me wrong, but this is my experience, that if you pray the right prayer, if you live the right life, these things don't happen. Or you can seek strongly enough to change that environment. And my parents, for whatever reason, I've done a 4-step on this. They did the best they could with whatever they were dealing with, the same thing that we were dealing with. They just dealt with it in a different way, and they chose not to inform us of how serious things were. So one day, I'm at school, and me and my brothers were all in the same school, and I get teachers comes and says, "You need to go down to the principal's office." I'm going, this is not good. And so on the way, I meet my brothers, and I'm going, the little precocious kid, I said, "Something's happened to Mom." And of course, she had passed away. But that event, opposed against all the religious stuff that I had in my mind, all those belief systems, didn't add up. And so that put a chink in the armor of what I'd been living for all those years. Some doubt. And I came to the understanding that maybe what I've been told, that we have all the answers, that don't challenge us. Maybe something's not 100% with that. And I carried that all through my teen years and early adolescence. But okay, so anyway, so my mom passes away. My grandmother comes to live with us, and my dad's left with 3 little boys to raise. But other than that, I mean, that's huge. But other than that, life continued as it was. And so And by the way, I didn't have a drink until I was almost 21 years old. So there's no teenage drunk-a-log here, no antics or any of that stuff. In fact, I'm just the opposite. I've heard people talk about, that they wanted to be the best little boy in the world. Well, also that memory of mom helped foster that, be the best little boy you can for mom, Anyway, so growing up, things are normal, and but it's in my teens, I'm told that I'm supposed to notice changes. I wasn't noticing the right changes. Things were happening that I'm going, oh, this is not what they told me this is supposed to be. So I graduate high school and go to college, and I'm sitting in UT Arlington one morning, Monday morning, and my instructor comes in and she says, well, I had an interesting weekend. She says, some friends of mine took me over to a gay bar in Dallas. I'm going, my little ears go, boop. And I get out my pen, I'm ready to take notes. And I did. She had gone to a club over in Dallas on Rawlins. The building's gone now. It was a beautiful white colonial mansion that had been converted to a bar. It was called the Bayou Club. Now there were other Bayou. There was Bayou Landing later and all that kind of stuff. This was the Bayou Club, and so I went to my phone book. Yes, we had phone books. And the Bayou Club was listed there, such and such Rawlins Street. And by now I'm 21. I'm 21, so so I look up the Bayou Club, and I instantly get in my car and drive. There it is. Is that really a gay bar? You just anyway. So one Saturday night I go, and I'm too terrified to go in. Yes, not yet. And so I park outside, and now I'm essentially stalking the Bayou Club. But I sit there and I watch, and these young men are coming in. I'm going, he's gay? He's gay, that one? And I did that 2 weeks in a row. And the third week, I find a parking place that I'm going to stay in, and I find my door opening, and my foot hits the ground. And once again, in spite of the fear, I'm putting one foot in front of the other, walking toward that door, and go up the steps, open the door, and go inside. And so I have no idea. I've had one beer at that point in my life. And so I go up to the bar, and I don't know anything. I don't know what to ask for. I say, Tom Collins? And so I got my drink. And then I turn around, and I'm sipping on my drink, and I'm leaning on the bar like I've been there all my life, Can you say deer in the headlights? And the lights come down, and the mirror ball starts turning, and the music comes up, and the song that I will remember till I take my last breath is a song by Mel Carter, and it was Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me. Oh. And these young men all come out to the dance floor, and they're holding each other, and they're dancing, and I have arrived. The only reason I really tell that is because I walked into that building a frightened, closeted, desperate young man, and life was never going to be the same again. And so as you can imagine, I'm not going to go into the other details, but I had a spiritual experience that night. Yeah. And I left. So now I was laid off from a job that had a really good job out at LTV and aerospace, and so I had some income, and I wasn't working, and I remember the thought going through my head, I'm going to do this as often as I possibly can, and I did. So I went from zero, never having walked into a bar, never having had a drink, to quite literally doing that every night for quite a while, and that's spiritual experience number 2, if you will. And for about the next 20 years, I drank like most people do in our community. I went to parties, I went to the bars, and but there was always a balancing act for me. Not necessarily party, but bars, to get just that right amount, that perfect blend of euphoria and do the thing that I'm there to do, to meet Mr. Wonderful, or go over the edge and have to go home probably legally drunk, and that was okay in the first few years, but the longer that went, the harder that was to do. And let's see, where do I want to go? I did meet someone. I had a relationship, and so the next thing that's significant is like in the mid-'80s, 1984, I was leaving a first partner, and I had a lot of situational anxiety pile up on me all at one time. And that job that I loved at a big communication company was in jeopardy of being laid off. Because they were splitting up and making a bunch of changes. Me and the partner were parting ways. I was buying a new house. I was involved in, but the key point is I was involved in a car wreck where I hit the windshield, and it was sore, but then life went on. About 6 weeks later, I started having intense pain in the muscles of my throat, larynx. And then I spent the next couple of years going to doctors trying to figure out what was going on. And what really came about is that I had such a habit of holding tension in my body that I was even totally unaware of that was causing physical pain with my vocal cords. And my job at that time was to communicate. I was a pre-sale engineer for AT&T. My job was to communicate highly technical issues to a bunch of people. So many times I would go home on a Friday night and just hibernate till Monday, resting so that I could struggle through the week. And that lasted for a couple of years. And I finally learned some relaxation techniques, meditation, if you will. They called them relaxation techniques, and that started to get better. But during that time, I was also having trouble sleeping, and I started self-medicating. What time is it? Okay. Self-medicating. I decided I'd have one glass of wine at night before going to bed to help me sleep. And of course, that turned into two. And I remember very clearly when I went from one glass of wine to two. I remember worrying, how is this going to affect me in the morning? 2 glasses of wine. Well, I sure got through that okay, so it turned, but by the time I was in my 40s, that I was beginning to cross that line of no return. And it was scary, it was frightening, but I couldn't do anything about it. Our book is real clear. There might have been a time when we could have stopped, but we didn't. Most of those years of drinking, I don't remember myself ever saying no to a drink. No, I'm good. I'm okay. Right? You want a drink? Sure, come on. And but I crossed that line. And in January of 2002, my partner at that time we were together almost 20 years, but he'd had enough. And because he had grown up in a intensely alcoholic home, and he was not gonna live with an alcoholic anymore. So I went to my first meeting at Aquarius up north of here, and ended up staying sober for a couple of years, 2.5, 3 years. And but as that's the guy that spoke about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Steve. He talked one thing. I loved the stuff he had to say. But one thing that really stuck with me. He says, "I almost did AA. I almost called my sponsor. I almost went to a meeting. I almost worked the steps." And nobody ever thinks that they're starting out to do half measures. I don't think anybody ever. It wasn't my intent to be half measures, but that's what I was. And so I relapsed, and then I started, and then once I relapsed, I couldn't stop relapsing, and that just continued to get worse and get worse and get worse. And when I first came to AA, at that point in 2002, I had never experienced a blackout. I came in here and I heard you all talk about blackouts. I'm going, how can you be awake to everybody else, and yet you're unconscious. I don't get that. Well, when I came back in 2009, I fully understood blackouts. In 2009, I assume it would happen today. If I would start drinking today well, first of all, I'd be in line at 5 minutes till noon to buy I think they've moved it now, but I'd be in line to buy my first 3 bottles of wine, first 3 bottles of wine. And I would be in a blackout in probably 15, 20 minutes, and I would be in that blackout around the clock. Today's Sunday, I'd be in there till Wednesday, Thursday maybe, and I'd go into my kitchen, and there'd be, not the first 3, but my kitchen counter would be covered in empty wine bottles. And I wouldn't remember, I might remember buying the first 3. So that's the way it was in 2009. But I remember clearly, because I'd had a whole lot of AA at that point, and I was coming to meetings. I was going to meetings. As soon as I detoxed and got feeling human again, I was right back into meetings. I never abandoned totally meetings, and I was relapsing. And I go, what is it that I'm not doing that these people seem to do? Why? And I was so frustrated and so desperate. And I remember sitting in the parking lot of Kroger on Cedar Springs at 7:05 with my first 3 bottles of wine and my hands on the steering wheel of my car going, life should just not be this hard. And so, because of my financial situation then, I had everything I owned was paid for. And I had an income from a retirement thing. And I sat in my car going, drink myself to death or come back and figure out what you guys are doing. And of course, I took the other one. So I came back, and I came back with a completely renewed sense of desperation and willingness. I'd been in treatment twice before, but one time I was there, and that psychiatrist that I met with, he says, I see you've been in AA. And he goes, yeah, I have. He goes, are you doing those 5 things they tell you about? I'm going, uh-huh. He goes, what are they? I managed to spit out the 5 things. Go wake up in the morning and ask your higher power to keep you sober that day. Go to a meeting, call your sponsor, connect with people, read literature, and at the end of the day say thanks. And but I managed to spit all that stuff out. Well, I came back with the willingness and desperation to do that, and do that because my life depended on it. Absolutely. And so when I came back, I also realized I needed to do. I'd been around for a while, and I'd hear John talk about service work, and Patrick about service work, and Mike about service work. I'm going, Terry probably doesn't need to do that yet, And so I came back all about service work. I became the coffee chair. I started working on the roundup, taking meetings to treatment centers, all of that stuff. And of course, things started to change. And one thing that really changed, my whole life shifted at this point. I heard Juana W. at a meeting. She said, on the way to the meeting, she said, I've been listening to Joe and Charlie at night, or coming to the meeting. And one of them made the point that one of them made. I'm going, Joe and Charlie? And so I went home and I Googled Joe and Charlie on my PC. Boom, 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 boom. All these things come up and going, wow. And so I discovered all these speakers that are out there that have 25, 30, 40, sometimes 50 years, like Sandy Beach and those guys. But I also discovered that there were recordings of Bill Wilson. Who knew? I could hear Bill Wilson in his voice talking about his experience. Wow. And I fell in love with the history of AA. And I fell in love with AA that day. And it's never been the same since. But listening to those CDs, I started listening to those in my car. I had quite a commute at that point. And I started buying that stuff like crazy and listening to workshops. And for the next 7-8 years, if I'm in my car by myself, I'm listening to those CDs. And so I'm carrying a meeting with, Scott Redmond, Bill, Bob Darrell, Peter Marinelli, those guys, everywhere I go. And so if you're new, I would suggest, for me, my experience was those jump-started my sobriety like nothing else could. And we had the guys, and we had the icons in our group, but I was listening to these guys too. You know, I took a meeting with me everywhere, and but also listening to those, I started finding out other points of interest. I learned about Ernie Kurtz and his study of us. He wasn't an AA guy, but he was a historian who studied us through grapevines and open meetings. And then I've heard about Harry Tebow. One of my dogs is named Tebow. So there's the point here too is that there's people outside of AA that highly influenced us and changed the course of AA because of their input. Ernie Kurtz wrote the book Not God. But in my search for CDs, I found a CD of his where he talks about the spirituality of AA. And it's about 70 minutes long. I make copies of it. I've got a link to it on Google Drive. And he helped me define from that experience that I had growing up. I knew that when I came back in 2009, I had to take a different approach. I had to have a new approach. Wasn't discounting what I'd grown up with, but I wasn't staying sober. And this is a spiritual program, so I needed a new approach. And he helped me get there. Harry Tebow wrote some papers he was a psychiatrist that studied us, and he studied specifically the role of ego and surrender in the role of alcoholism. He wrote several papers, but the two that I focus on, and I give these to sponsees today. One was, let me get the name right. One is called Ego Factors in Surrender in Alcoholism, and then another one is Surrender versus Compliance. And in that first one, he talks about there's two things. It's a long paper. It's like 9 pages long. It's very, very, very hard to read, but he talked about the syndrome, and I've heard it in meetings before, the king baby syndrome, how we're all kind of immature when we come in here, and we kind of want our ways, and we want, we're like a 2-year-old, we want our way when we want it, how we want it, blah, 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 and that we don't really grow out of that very much sometimes. Does that strike some nerves somewhere? I don't know. It does me, I know. But the other thing is that the role of that by its very nature, a spiritual experience will dissipate. It must be reinforced. Now, I grew up in that Southern religion where we had revivals, So every summer we would have a week-long whatever. But so I have found that to be true in my recovery, too, is that I need to rejuvenate my spiritual awakening over and over. The other paper that he wrote was, and it nails me totally, was called Compliance versus Surrender, and he goes on to therapeutic process specific to alcoholism. And this one nails, it coincides with our program, and it nails me. It's that there's a difference between surrendering to something like my alcoholism, step one, and just complying with the program. So all those years that I was relapsing, I was complying. I was, about to do this, halfway doing that, because, and his point is, on page 30 it talks about that innermost self must be convinced, that innermost self must be convinced. He would call that the unconscious. And this paper goes through talking about how until that innermost self, that subconscious, is thoroughly, completely convinced, it's not over. And so on July the 23rd, 2009, I became convinced, and I was finally willing. And so move on from that. And so I'm listening to a CD with Bill Wilson, and he was recorded many times. Dr. Bob, not so much. Dr. Bob wasn't really much of a speaker. His last talk was at the 1950 St. Louis conference, Cleveland conference, and he spoke for maybe 10 minutes. And that's the last recording of Dr. Bob. But Bill was recorded many times. And he spoke at all of the first international conventions. And when I was listening to a recording of one of those, and it was very scratchy because it's analog and it's really old. And he got to the point of his experience in Towns Hospital. And he talked about that moment, and he used a word. He said, I'm going to use a word, and it's not a popular word. It's got some controversy. Some people don't like this word. He said, but my spiritual conversion. And I'm driving along listening to this. I'm going, whoa. And I pulled over, and I backed it up and listened to it again. From what I had grown up with, that made a huge, huge impact. And I connected. At that moment, I connected back with that little kid that had been in that spiritual stuff early on. And I didn't understand why it affected me as strongly as it did. And it took me about 2 or 3 days to figure it out. It was surrender. It was for the first time. And then when that realization came over me, I went like, now I finally get it. I finally get the amount of surrender that Terry is going to have to achieve. And that means being willing to do anything to stay sober. And so that was a landmark. And then just the other day, I was reading, how many times have I read Bill's story? And Bill's story on page 9, he says, 10 maybe. On 10, when Bill is at his rock bottom and Ebby comes to meet with him, and he says that they'd already talked for hours, and he says that, and of course, Bill's story, the first page of Bill's story is his experience at Winchester Cathedral at the beginning of World War I. And he says that wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back again. And then he says, thus, the real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. And so I've never been the same since that experience when I connected today in the surrender back to that little boy that walked that aisle in 1956. So I love AA, if you can't tell. How much time do we have? Okay, we have a little bit of time. So from that, the history, I got involved so much in the history, and I wanted to feel the history. So I went to New York 2 times by myself because I wanted to be on Terry's time, Terry's schedule. And out on the Stepping Stone site, there's a whole list of New York sites that still exist. And so I took that list and went to New York, and I looked up Calvary Episcopal Church. So I went by and looked at the church where the Oxford group started, where Bill and Ebby met. There's a mission down on 24th Street. I went and found that. It's a deli now. And I went and stood on West Central Park in front of the building that was Towns Hospital. I had my umbrella. It was a rainy day, and I just stood in the rain. They must have thought I was crazy. And I'm standing in the rain just looking at that building going, that's probably where the doctor's opinion was written. How cool is that? And that's where Bill Wilson got sober. That's where he worked with his first AAs. And then I went up to Bedford Hills. And then another trip, I went to Akron. And I just picked a day and went. And so on a Thursday morning, I'm sitting in the parking lot of the Sieberling estate where Henrietta Sieberling had lived. And I'm waiting for the park, the park, because it's now the house is magnificent. If you ever get there, it's like blown away, big house up anyway. But the point of interest is the Gate Lodge, and that's where Henrietta Sieberling and her kids were living. She was a daughter-in-law of the house people, and so I'm sitting in my car, and it's 5 minutes till 9 or 10 or whatever. So I get up and I go and I wait at the door, and they open the door, and I said, well, I'm a friend of Bill, and I'm here to see the Gate Lodge. And they go, oh, well, this is our first day of the season, and we're not doing tours of that building today. Now, if I'd come a day earlier, they were closed. You know, do 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 do. Anyway, and she said, "Here's the keys. Go spend whatever time you need in that lodge, and have a great time." So I went by myself, unlocked the door, and went in, and I found the room, a little tiny room, like this corner over here, where where Dr. Bob and Bill met, and I had it to myself for as long as I wanted to be there, and that was cool. And I just imagine what was happening on that Sunday night when Dr. Bob said, "I'll give you 15 minutes," and they talked for 6 hours. So then I went over to Dr. Bob's house. Guess how many steps there are up to the front door? 12. And so I did the tour, and while we were upstairs, the guide said, you know, some people, in those days, you didn't go to a meeting until you've done step 3. And where they did step 3 was upstairs in the daughter's room, Sue's room, and they go, you know, some people stay up here if they choose, and you know, maybe do a 3rd step prayer. And I thought, I'm doing that. So everybody else went downstairs, and I'm kind of hanging out, going, hurry up, and because I don't want you to see me do this. And I got on my knees and said the 3rd step prayer. So, as you can imagine, all these years later, I love AA. I love all of you all. And my concept of a higher power today has changed. That it comes to me through you guys. It's a two-way energy going on. And because of you, because of the program of AA, and because I surrendered that back in July of 2009, today I'm once again safe and protected, and I love all y'all. Okay.